Getting dressed usually happens too fast to notice. You pull on a shirt, step into your pants, reach for your shoes, and move on. Somewhere in that routine is one of the most ordinary objects in your life: underwear. It is the first layer, the hidden layer, the piece almost nobody talks about unless it is uncomfortable. And yet that quiet layer raises a surprisingly good question. When did humans start wearing underwear in the first place? Most people would probably guess the answer has something to do with modesty. But for much of history, the first reason was even simpler than that. Underwear began as a practical barrier between the body and the much more valuable clothing worn over it. Let's get into it right here on Secrets of Simple Things. Before underwear, clothing was hard to wash. Today, doing laundry is mostly a matter of time and electricity. A washing machine can clean an entire load of clothes in less than an hour. For most of human history, it wasn't that simple. Clothes were expensive. Fabric had to be spun into thread, woven into cloth, and carefully sewn by hand. Many people owned only a few garments, sometimes just a single set of outer clothing. Replacing them required time, skill, and valuable materials. Washing them was just as challenging. Heavy garments made from wool or thick textiles were difficult to scrub and slow to dry. Washing them too often could damage the fibers or cause them to lose shape. Because of this, outer clothing was washed only occasionally. But the human body creates its own problems. Sweat, body oils, and dust accumulate quickly during daily life. So people developed a simple solution. Instead of constantly washing the outer garment, they wore a lighter layer underneath it. That inner layer absorbed sweat and protected the more valuable clothing on top. Because this inner garment was smaller and made from lighter fabric, it could be washed more frequently. In many households, the inner linen layer handled the daily contact with the body while outer garments remained relatively clean. In other words, underwear began as a protective barrier between the human body and expensive clothing. It wasn't glamorous, but it solved a real problem. Simple inner garments in the ancient world. Once you start looking for it, the idea of underwear appears surprisingly early in history. In ancient Egypt, men commonly wore a garment called a shendit, a simple linen wrap tied around the waist. It functioned much like a loincloth and was well suited to Egypt's warm climate. Linen was the ideal material because it was breathable, lightweight, and easier to wash than heavier fabrics. In ancient Rome, men sometimes wore a similar undergarment known as a sublaculum, which was tied around the waist beneath a tunic. Roman women also had their own inner garments. Some wore a breastband called a strophium, which provided support beneath clothing during daily activity. None of these garments looked like modern underwear. They had no elastic, no standard sizing, and no consistent design. But the principle was already clear. A washable layer worn close to the skin helped manage sweat, movement, and daily wear. In warm climates, it could also prevent rough fabrics from rubbing directly against the body. These garments were simple, practical, and usually made from linen because linen handled repeated washing better than most other fabrics of the time. At this stage, underwear had nothing to do with style. It was simply part of the quiet engineering of everyday clothing. The Middle Ages. Clothing in layers. By the Middle Ages in Europe, clothing had evolved into a clear system of layers. Men commonly wore loose linen underpants known as braies. These garments were usually knee-length and tied at the waist with a drawstring. On top of them, men wore hose, trousers, and a tunic. Linen remained the preferred fabric for inner garments because it was breathable and relatively easy to wash. Women's underwear during this period is less clearly documented. For many years, historians believed that women in medieval Europe rarely wore underpants, but archaeological discoveries have complicated that assumption. In 2012, a group of linen undergarments was discovered in an Austrian castle. Among them were garments resembling early bras and fitted underwear dating back to the 15th century. This discovery suggested that some women were already wearing structured undergarments much earlier than historians once believed. Clothing habits were never identical everywhere. Different regions, climates, and social classes often developed their own solutions. But one idea remained consistent. Clothing worked in layers. The inner linen garment handled sweat and direct contact with the body. The outer layers provided warmth, protection, and social appearance. Underwear remained mostly invisible, but it quietly played an essential role in daily life. In the centuries ahead, however, inner garments would take on a new purpose. They would begin shaping how the body itself appeared. When underwear started shaping fashion. As Europe moved into the Renaissance and later centuries, clothing became more structured and expressive. Fashion was no longer only about covering the body. It was about creating a specific silhouette. For women, this often meant wearing corsets, also known as stays. These garments were worn beneath dresses to shape the torso and create the narrow waist that defined fashionable appearance for centuries. Corsets were carefully constructed garments made from multiple layers of fabric reinforced with materials such as whalebone or metal. Although they were hidden beneath outer clothing, they acted almost like a structural frame that determined the final shape of an outfit. Men's undergarments were evolving as well. The traditional braies gradually became shorter, and garments resembling early underpants began to appear. By the 18th century, women in many parts of Europe wore loose underpants called drawers beneath their skirts. Interestingly, many drawers were open at the crotch. This might seem unusual today, but it solved a practical problem. With large layered skirts and several garments worn at once, removing clothing quickly was difficult. Open drawers made everyday life easier. Clothing design often reflects practical needs as much as fashion trends. But the next major transformation in underwear would not come from fashion. It would come from industry. The Industrial Revolution changes underwear. The 19th century transformed clothing in ways earlier generations could hardly imagine. Industrial machines made textile production faster and far more efficient. Fabric that once required weeks of labor could now be manufactured in large quantities. As textiles became more affordable, clothing gradually became accessible to more people. Undergarments benefited from this change as well. Cotton began replacing linen in many garments because it worked well with industrial spinning machines. Cotton was soft, absorbent, and easier to produce in large amounts. Manufacturers also began producing standardized sizes, allowing undergarments to be sold widely instead of being individually tailored. One well-known example from this period was the Union suit, a one-piece garment that covered the body from wrists to ankles. Popular in the late 19th century, it served as both underwear and thermal clothing in colder climates. Women's outfits during this time could still include several hidden layers, such as a chemise, drawers, corset, and petticoats worn beneath a dress. Victorian society placed strong emphasis on modesty, so undergarments remained carefully concealed. But one important feature of modern underwear had not yet appeared: elastic. Most garments still relied on buttons, ties, or drawstrings to stay in place. They worked, but they were not always comfortable. That would soon change. The moment underwear became modern. The early 20th century introduced several innovations that shaped the underwear we recognize today. In 1913, an American woman named Mary Phelps Jacob created an early version of the modern bra. She reportedly fashioned it from 2 handkerchiefs and ribbon because traditional corsets felt too restrictive beneath an evening dress. Her design was lighter and more flexible, and over time bras gradually replaced corsets in everyday clothing. Men's underwear was changing as well. In 1934, Cooper's Incorporated, later known as Jockey, introduced the first modern briefs. The design removed the long legs of earlier garments and provided more direct support. The product sold out quickly after reaching stores. Around the same time, boxer shorts appeared. Inspired by the loose shorts worn by professional boxers, they offered a more relaxed alternative to briefs. The familiar question, boxers or briefs, had officially arrived. Perhaps the most important development, however, was the widespread use of elastic waistbands. Elastic allowed underwear to stretch and adapt comfortably to the body without complicated fastenings. For the first time, inner garments were designed primarily around comfort and movement. Underwear was no longer just protecting clothing, it was adapting to the person wearing it. When underwear stopped staying hidden. After World War II, the story changed again. Synthetic materials such as nylon and later spandex made underwear stretchier, lighter, and more form-fitting. At the same time, advertising began shifting the meaning of underwear in the public imagination. Instead of selling it only as a practical necessity, brands increasingly sold ideas around it: attractiveness, confidence, body image, sex appeal, aspiration. By the 1980s and 1990s, underwear had become something closer to a statement. Logos moved onto waistbands. Waistbands themselves were designed to be seen. Campaigns such as Calvin Klein advertisements helped turn men's underwear into a pop culture symbol rather than a purely private garment. Women's lingerie evolved in a similar expansion of meaning. It became not just a hidden layer, but part of a larger industry built around fashion, luxury, self-presentation, and empowerment. That is one of the strangest turns in the history of underwear. Something created to sit quietly beneath everything else eventually became something people intentionally revealed. The closest layer. Today, underwear comes in countless forms. Some designs manage moisture during exercise, others focus on comfort, support, or seamless construction. There are also more choices than ever before in size, style, and design. Yet the basic idea remains surprisingly familiar. Underwear still sits at the boundary between the body and the outside world. Thousands of years ago, that boundary protected valuable clothing from sweat and daily wear. Today it protects comfort, movement, and personal expression. It's easy to overlook a garment that most people never see, yet its history quietly reflects thousands of years of human problem-solving, from ancient linen wraps to modern fabrics engineered for movement. Sometimes the most ordinary objects tell the longest stories, and sometimes the layer closest to our skin carries a history we almost never notice. If you enjoy discovering the hidden logic behind ordinary things, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the most familiar objects in everyday life carry the longest stories. And once you start looking closer, you begin to realize how many of the things around us have histories we rarely notice.